news show. The Taliban had first taken control of Afghanistan back in 1996, and it had remained in power for a total of 5 years. During this period, the Taliban held public executions, amputated people who were found guilty of theft, and women were mandated to wear burqas and were denied the opportunity to go to work or school. Apart from this, television, cinema, and music was banned as well. Though all this came to an end after the United States invaded the country in 2001 to find Osama bin Laden. The Taliban regime had collapsed right after. But last year, after 20 years, the Taliban came back to power. This happened after the US, which had been waging a war against the Taliban, started withdrawing troops from the country. In fact, exactly 1 year ago today, all foreign troops left the country. Now, the immediate fear when this happened was whether the Taliban would do what it had done back in the 90s. Whether women will face the same kind of oppression, whether the rights of ordinary citizens will be curtailed, and whether the country's economy will crash. In this episode, we take a comprehensive look at how Afghanistan has fared since the Taliban came to power 1 year ago. And for this, we will be speaking to Indian Express's National Editor of Strategic Affairs, Nirupama Subramanian, who recently went to Afghanistan to report on it. And she starts by telling us the difference between when the Taliban came to power last year and when it had come to power in the 90s. And she says that in the 90s, the country was in a state of ruin.
I mean, there was no infrastructure virtually. Everything was destroyed. First, there was a huge war between the Soviet Red Army and the Mujahideen. And then there was a civil war between all factions of the Mujahideen. And then the Taliban fought off all the Mujahideen and came to power. So there was continuous war since 79. And in that, everything was all but destroyed. And in 2021, when the Taliban walked into Kabul, they were actually walking into a ready-made city, because over the last 20 years, what has happened is people have poured in money as development aid. They have helped to rebuild Afghanistan since the ouster of the last Taliban regime.
For example, India has spent $4 billion in Afghanistan to build highways, hospitals, schools, power lines, sanitation projects, and even the parliament building.
And many other countries have contributed to the development assistance. In fact, until 2021, Afghanistan was pretty much running on foreign financial assistance.
But this stopped after the takeover, because the international community did not recognize the Taliban formally. And Nirupama says that due to sanctions, their access to international banking and finances was very limited. So even though they took over the country, they didn't have the money to run it.
So the banks shut down. There was a huge humanitarian crisis because there was a famine, there was winter coming up, there was no power, no food, no wheat. So it was all for the first 6-8 months. I think there was a calamitous kind of feeling about what is going to happen in Afghanistan. And then countries started sending in aid. I think way out was found in the UN, where they carved out an exemption for humanitarian aid. And then money started going to pay teachers, to pay civil servants, pay hospital workers.
She says that it is this humanitarian aid that has helped Afghanistan during this time. But the Taliban is actually focused on strengthening the economy right now. It has said that it wants to achieve economic independence because foreign aid comes with a lot of restrictions and liabilities.
So they've been very focused on this, and they have surprisingly raised some $2.1 billion over the last few months in revenue. So I asked the foreign ministry spokesman as to how they raised this money. And the foreign ministry spokesman, whose name is Abdul Kahar Balkhi, he said that Afghanistan is the heart of Asia and we are ready to do trade with anyone, and we'll charge for people who do trade with each other through our country. So basically, they're charging customs fees, they're charging transit fees, and they're also leasing out their mines to individual Afghan people privately.
And at the same time, some Chinese companies have been roped in to do oil and mineral exploration. She says that it is estimated that Afghanistan's mineral wealth is worth around $1 trillion, and the Taliban wants to capitalize on that. Now, when talking about this new Taliban regime, Nirupama says that it is a bit different from the one in the 90s.
So while they have placed a lot of restrictions on individual freedoms, the way you can dress, the way you can appear, for instance, it is prescribed that a man keep a beard and wear traditional dress, which is a salwar kameez, and that a woman should cover herself from head to toe, should not show her wrists or ankles, so which means a head covering and a full abaya. But they have not prescribed the face cover so far. That is not there. And they're not really strictly enforcing these things either. So the main big anti-people measure, if you can call it that, is that they have banned the education of girls from class 6. And that is really a big thing, because the multiplier effects of this, or the effects down the line, downstream of this, are very, very ominous. It has the potential of turning children into child labor, child slavery, trafficking. So many girls are just not going to school now beyond a certain age. From class 7 to class 12, there's no school. They're just sitting at home.
And this is what is really worrying the world. When Nirupama talked to the foreign ministry spokesman about this, he told her that in about a half a dozen districts outside Kabul, girls are continuing to go to school.
And I checked with some aid workers and they say that this is true. So that means roughly 1/3 of the districts of Afghanistan in which girls can continue to go to school.
Plus, she says the other way that people are getting around this ban is by going to private courses, which have not been banned yet.
So you go for an English language course, for instance. So you see a lot of kids clutching their books, and girl students, clad head to toe, and they're clutching their books and they're going to study English. Now in Kabul, they haven't stopped this. So that's one thing. Then there are these other classes which are run by women activists. They don't charge. It's free. And this is for more underprivileged people. So in these secret classes, the children are taught a lot of things, meaning they're taught some basic math also. They're taught some science. They're taught English. They're taught Dari.
Dari is the most widely spoken language in Afghanistan. Nirupama says that besides learning new things, children also go to these classes to meet their friends and revise old lessons. And in one of these underground classes, she happened to meet a mother and a daughter who revealed a lot about the situation in the country.
The mother had her education disrupted in 96 during the first Taliban regime, and she could never pick it up, and she doesn't know how to read or write. And she's coming to the school with her daughter, so she's able to pick up something so she can teach her other children also, and she can also sort of pick up some basic math and things like that. And also her daughter, who says she wants to be a teacher herself. So it was quite a thing actually, two Taliban regimes, two women, separated by a generation, and they're both in the same boat under the Taliban's draconian interpretations of Islam that girls beyond a certain point can't study.
She also says that most women have been asked to stay home and not go to work. A lot of women civil servants, for example, now go to work once a week just to sign the registers. And some who do go to work regularly are not allowed to sit with the men. And this segregation can also be seen in public places like parks and restaurants, where women are continuing to show up.
For instance, I went to a restaurant which has a women's section, and wow, there were so many women there. I couldn't believe it. And then they've segregated parks. For instance, it is on alternate days for men and women in some parks. And then the famous Bagh-e-Babar, which is a garden that Babar ordered to be built in Kabul, they have partitioned it into men and women.
Now, besides curbing the freedom of women, media freedom in the country has also been severely curtailed. Nirupama says that after 2001, a lot of media outlets had come up in Afghanistan, but hundreds of these outfits were shut down after the Taliban came to power.
There were women-only stations where there was education of women's rights. There was programs on domestic violence, many, many varieties of programs, entertainment, sports, music. On television, it was all this, plus dramas, so many things. All that has been completely hit. It's a big setback for the media, because the first thing was there'll be no entertainment, there'll be no music, and I think sports also was banned. In fact, Tolo people told me, Tolo is the biggest channel there, and they told me that they are thinking of restarting the sports channel now. But I think media has been very badly hit, especially in the provinces where a lot of outlets have shut down. Many, many journalists are out of jobs. So all the top guys in media have gone. All the people who ran the stations or provided leadership roles in the newsrooms, they've all gone. They are living in Canada or Germany or some other Western countries, whoever would take them, or even Iran, and, sitting there. And Pakistan, where they're sitting to apply for visas to other countries.
When talking about human rights, it is also worth pointing out that the United Nations has reported at least 160 extrajudicial killings, 178 arbitrary detentions, and 56 instances of torture and ill treatment of foreign government and military officials. But despite this, one thing that the Taliban continues to claim is that now there is peace in the region, and the security situation is better. But this is not really the case.
See, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of the Al-Qaeda, was found in Kabul, and he was taken out by a US Hellfire missile fired from an unmanned drone. So that means Al-Qaeda is there. Daesh is very much there, which is Islamic State Khorasan province. They have carried out several attacks. They carried out the attack on the Gurdwara, and then recently when I was there was an attack on a mosque in which so many people died. So I don't think there is peace in that sense. I mean, conflict still looms large over Afghanistan.
And she says that this can be seen from the fact that Taliban fighters always carry guns with them. And even when she spoke to some of these fighters, they told her that they are still facing security threats, hence the guns.
So there is an absence of war, but it is not peace. And that absence of war, though, is a big thing for Afghans themselves. I mean, when you go out to eat somewhere or when you go out shopping, you're not expecting to be caught in crossfire. You're not expecting to be blown up in a bomb blast. So people feel a little more secure in that sense. And I've spoken to aid agencies who say now they go everywhere. The whole country is now accessible. Earlier it wasn't, because it was the stronghold of one group or the other, and you could get caught in crossfire. So in that sense, the absence of war has made the people feel more secure. But the Taliban are still in fighting mode, and they expect a threat to their regime. So these are all the elements of the situation in that country right now.
Now, after talking about the economic, humanitarian, and the security situation in the region, we talk about how India, which has had a long relationship with Afghanistan, has reacted to this crisis. Nirupama says India's first reaction when the Taliban took over was to shut down the embassy in Kabul, and it also refused to engage with the new regime. And this is because India had bad memories of the Taliban. Back in 1999, 5 men belonging to the Taliban had hijacked an Indian Airlines flight carrying 190 people. And they later demanded, among other things, the release of Maulana Masood Azhar, who is a designated global terrorist and who at the time was lodged in a jail in Jammu. And India, to save the people on board, had to agree to the demand. And this was a big deal.
And then, of course, there was the bombing of the Indian embassy in Kabul in 2008 on the 7th of July 2008, in which an IFS officer passed away and he was killed, and a brigadier who was a military advisor to the Indian embassy in Kabul, he was also killed, and a lot of people, I think about 60 people were killed in that big bombing.
Later, India came to know through the US that the bombing was carried out by the Haqqani network, a group which is part of the Taliban. So security was a big concern for India.
But what happened over the last 8 months is that India found itself increasingly the only one in the region that did not have engagement with the Taliban. Everybody else seemed to have gone in, reopened the embassies, and kept a certain level of diplomatic presence, not at the top levels, but they had people on the ground, they were engaging with the regime, as it were, and even the US was operating through the Qatar embassy. Basically, it had outsourced some consular functions to the Qatar embassy. The Chinese never closed, the Russians never closed, and Pakistan, of course, never closed.
And this was also a big concern because Afghanistan has a lot of strategic importance for India, especially considering the fact that it shares a border with Pakistan. And this is why India later decided to reach out to the Taliban and also reopen its embassy in Kabul. But besides strategic importance, the people-to-people relations between the two countries are also very strong. People from Afghanistan, in fact, are very fond of India. And these relations are what Indian agencies have talked about as well.
But the Indian government has acted against this, in a sense, by stopping all visas, cancelling all the visas that pre-existed. The Taliban takeover cancelled all those visas. They've not been issuing visas, or they've been issuing very few visas to Afghans. A lot of students who went back during COVID and went back in the summer of 2021 thinking they'd come back are all stuck there. They've no way to come out. There are people who applied for scholarships and got admissions this academic year, and they haven't been able to come to Afghanistan. So they're all stuck. And I think this is one of the big tragedies of, India curtailing its operations in Afghanistan. I get calls after my 1 week in Kabul and meeting these students. I still get messages from these people saying, when are they going to reopen their visas? And the other thing, of course, is, the Taliban itself wants India to come back and restart projects that it had left incomplete. One of these is the Shatut Dam just outside Kabul, which is to provide drinking water to people living in Kabul. I think it will cater to about 2 million people in Kabul. This is something that the spokesman Abdul Kahar Balki mentioned to me. So there are possibilities, but there are also limits. And one of those limits is how much influence does Pakistan continue to have on the Taliban? Sirajuddin Haqqani, who's the interior minister, is very close to the Pakistan deep state or the security establishment. So there are possibilities and there are limitations to those possibilities.
The one thing that is clear right now is that Afghanistan's future is uncertain, because no one knows how long the Taliban will manage to stay in power.
Now, in Kabul, it's the land of the great game. So people have been watching power change hands for so long that they're quite sure that this too is not going to last. But how long it'll last, how long all this will go on, nobody can say. And, there are reports of all these factions and divisions within the Taliban. So people are expecting that at some point, all those things may flare up and become unmanageable for the regime because of the presence of these terrorist elements like Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Some external actor may come back, may return to Afghanistan. But the thing is that I was speaking to some people who deal with the Taliban on a daily basis, with the regime. And they were saying that whatever be it, whether it's internal divisions or tensions with the Haqqani group, whatever it is, this time they're determined that they are not going to fail, that they will make this last. This is according to some people who have everyday dealings with the Taliban, that they are saying that this is the message that's coming out, and which is why they are so keen to get that economy part of it going as well as the security part of it. They want to be very pakka about their security. But it is not clear how they're going to do all this, where they're going to get the stability from, where they're going to get the money from. So everything is still very uncertain. When you go to Kabul, you get a feeling of uncertainty hanging in the air. And it only increases when you see a lot of people with guns just roaming the city in pickup trucks or at various checkpoints. So there isn't an air of certainty about anything in Kabul right now.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.